Hi. We're at Elemental's booth at the SCTE Cable Tech Expo, and we have a chance to talk with Keith Wimes, the Vice President of Marketing for Elemental. This is a unique moment, I guess, in some respects for the cable industry, which has sort of gone out of its way to ignore 4K.
Right.
But, you know, after what we saw at IBC and what we've seen over the last few months, it's getting hard to ignore. And I guess you guys haven't been ignoring it because you're showing actual live encoding of HEVC for 4K, which is pretty unique.
Yeah, I mean, it's a progression, right? So over the last 6 months, 7 months or so, we've showcased a number of firsts for us. At NAB, we showed 4K file-based processing for H.264 based encoding. So that was the first time that we had showcased 4K. At IBC this year, we then progressed that to showing HEVC, but it was for file-based. It was both 30 frames a second and 60 frames a second. But we weren't quite at real-time yet. And what we're able to show here today is the first implementation of a real-time implementation for 4K HEVC. And we're running here live at 30 frames a second. And the bit rate is really low for 4K. It's at 12 megabits, and the quality is really outstanding. So, you know, I think 4K is obviously really early days still. The TV sets are starting to come down. On the decode side, the chipsets are starting to get more advanced and come out of kind of prototyping phase. But I think 2014, with some of the indications that have been seen from companies like Netflix predicting that they're going to come out with 4K before anyone in the cable or IPTV or satellite space, I think it's going to create a momentum builder really going into 2014 and 15 that'll shake up the industry quite a bit.
Now, what you're doing here with the live encoding of a file, so that it's real-time encoding of something that was pre-recorded, but it's the same thing as if it was live broadcast, is high motion. So you're talking about doing 12 megabits per second for a sports kind of video. And now that's obviously at 30 frames per second, right?
Correct.
What is your estimation of what that's going to be at what is arguably probably the standard that we're going to see coming out with the 60 frames per second? And I guess also this isn't 10-bit yet, right? This is still 8-bit.
So what we're showing here today is a 30 frame a second 8-bit implementation. What we showed at IBC for our file-based approach was actually we did an 8-bit, 10-bit comparison, and we also did a 30 frame a second, 60 frame a second comparison.
Okay.
We tend to think that 10-bit and 60 frames a second is going to be what is required when it goes to commercial deployment. That's going to take us some time to get to, but it's not going to be years. We're going to approach getting to 60 frames a second in the first quarter of this year. So first quarter of next year, I guess.
Right.
So we're months away from getting there, and we've already implemented the 10-bit color on our file-based processing, and we're able to implement it on the live processing as well. It doesn't take that much extra horsepower actually to do the 8-bit versus 10-bit color.
So versus 12 megabits, we're talking 15?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at 15 to 18 into an implementation that is the full frame rate. And when you're doing that, you're getting multiple 4Ks in a QAM when you think about that in terms of megabits per second. So it's a pretty compelling argument, I think, for the satellite industry, eventually for the cable industry as they start to adopt as well.
Now, what's this mean from the standpoint of the horsepower on processing required for the kinds of chipsets that you're using? Is this going to require quite an additional installation of servers to accommodate once it rolls?
Yeah, so in terms of the file-based world, we're able to do pure software upgrades of our existing systems, which is kind of nice. On the real-time side, it is pushing the envelope of all processing. So whether, our proposition really is a hybrid approach of combination of CPUs and GPUs. It's using the most advanced chips in both areas, and it doesn't necessarily get to real-time. If we go back and look at equipment that was deployed a couple years ago, it can't support real-time of 4K HEVC. particularly at a 60 frames per second. So there is going to be hardware involved in terms of the investment required to do real-time 4K HEVC, but for all other applications, it's a software upgrade for our customers. So if they're doing, maybe initially they're doing on-demand to match perhaps what Netflix might come out with next year, existing gear that's out there can handle it, but your density goes down. Your capabilities are being consumed in a different way. We really made our name in this business from the perspective 3 years ago of coming at it from a multi-screen capability. We came with really powerful underlying architecture that would be applied to the multi-screen issue, which at the time was, how do I create all the different renditions of content that are required for multi-screen delivery to tablets and phones and gaming devices. Now we're just redirecting some of that horsepower to other problems like HEVC, which can have 6 to 10 times the computational requirement of H.264, or in the case of 4K, just having more pixels to process. It's also a challenge that eats up the cycles essentially of the processors.
I guess the question on certainly cable operators' minds is, okay, it's starting to move, the sets are out there, costs are coming down, but those sets still don't have HEVC in them, and so, as you mentioned, the decoders have to be implemented.
Yeah.
That's probably a second quarter or later kind of phenomenon.
Yep.
So we won't see those. Of course, we do have very high-end sets that are already doing 4K in HEVC, but for ones that are in anything approaching a reasonable price range, that'll take a while. But that said, you mentioned Netflix is out there, and we know that they are reprocessing their film base, to the extent they have the licenses to do it. They're turning it into 4K suited stuff. Reed Hastings, their CEO, has made clear that they're going to go for it in the year ahead. And they don't care that it's just a handful of users that will have this. It'll give them an added cachet. And so when that happens, the question for the cable operator becomes, okay, do I have to get on this nascent bandwagon now? Or can I wait a while? But ultimately, the clock's ticking, right? I mean, it's going to be a matter of, you're going to have to do it sooner or later.
I think if you look at the history of traditional pay TV operators, they were always looking for a complete end-to-end, all the way to the TV set. The way the world's evolved recently in the last 3 to 5 years, I think they have the capability to match a Netflix offering very quickly if they decide to do so. Software-based decoding, the fact that people are starting to watch videos at closer distances. So if you take a look at 4K, for instance, on a 2-foot experience on a 32-inch monitor, it's an experience that is remarkably different from from a typical HD scenario, and so they could deliver over-the-top types of content in 4K very early. They don't have to wait for a traditional set-top box to be able to decode 4K HEVC, or for the TV sets, they may go for a different type of experience potentially.
Yeah, and mentioning the set-top boxes, of course, that has the same gating issues as the smart TVs. However, it's a whole nother issue as far as getting that in the homes when the cable operator is footing the bill to do that.
Yeah, it's an expensive proposition.
So obviously, it's going to make sense if you're going to do 4K service for any near-term projects or strategies, you're going to be doing it over the top.
Right.
And of course, the cable operator then has an advantage because they've got the higher bandwidth. They have the managed network capabilities that go with that, so they can, get that experience over broadband to really resonate with the end users. We're seeing the bandwidth increasing now with all kinds of strategies all the way up to DOCSIS 3.1 to get that high bandwidth into the home to support this sort of thing. Yep. It's kind of interesting because it also raises the possibility that by virtue of that higher bandwidth and those options that are going out there, they'll be creating their own competitive pressures to have to do this, because then it won't just be Netflix jumping on that bandwagon. It'll be Hulu, it'll be Vudu, it'll be...
It'll be interesting to see. That's not bad for vendors, so I'm going to smile about that. But I think you're right. I think it will create kind of a rolling thunder that eventually extends more into the home. And there's going to be a large battle, right? I mean, the battle that's going on between new entrants and the incumbents is a real one. It's being fought in IP-based delivery, whether that goes to a traditional box that is doing some of the tuning or doing some of the on-demand kind of interface. It may be we're getting into the age of bring your own device in terms of video consumption. And so I think it's going to be on all those fronts eventually, but you might as well meet the challenge head on because you can move quickly in that area to do it in a more software IP-based approach.
Now, of course, in the traditional VOD realm, one of the operators' strong suits against the likes of Netflix has been the earlier window releases that go into VOD compared to what Netflix typically has available as movies. Now, though, there's a new wrinkle, which is that early window is going to come at a new cost, which is having to watermark those more recently released movies.
Yep.
I think it's a question as to where that line will be drawn as to what has to be watermarked coming out of Netflix at this point, but that doesn't seem to be part of their plan. But for the operator, that gets to be pretty interesting as an added encumbrance. Are you doing anything in that vein in terms of working with any vendor partners?
Yeah, I mean, we've announced publicly that we're fully implemented with Civolution, for instance, in terms of their watermarking capability.
Okay.
This is one of the areas where we're known to be a very powerful encoding vendor, but we have this flexibility because we're a complete software-based approach. So as the industry has innovated, whether that be in watermarking or areas like tagging and tracking with Nielsen and ID3 tagging,
right,
we're able to implement those things very quickly because we have control of the software stack and because we're running on general purpose. Some of this stuff touches the video now, right? So to bake that into hardware is going to become one of the big questions, I think, over the next 2 years. Traditionally, video processing has kind of innovated at the software level and then it's been baked into hardware. I think things are changing a little bit too much, and I think we're going to chat a little bit about cloud. That's a really good, clear example of the power of having a flexible software-based architecture as opposed to hardware.
The idea of this somehow translating into being a capability that has to be implemented on the set-top box or on the television set, it gets to be nightmarish if there's some way to do it on the fly. And of course, companies like Civolution are definitely looking at making that per stream implementation possible to identify that user from remotely, not on the set top.
Right.
So let's come back to the live question. There's all this talk about live 4K. It's a whole new set of cameras. It's a whole, if you're talking about sports, it's different aspect ratios on the scene. Therefore, you have to have different commentators talking to 4K versus this, that, and the other thing. And then there's the question of, okay, what is the value if it's not movies in terms of just live productions in general, if it's not sports, if that's too hard. So how do you see live coming into play here, and what will that be a consumer-driven kind of thing that just people take advantage of that, again, comes in over the top, or is that going to be implemented in the pay TV space?
I think there's all types of implications in terms of 4K. There's a lot of content, there's this question of access to the content for folks within the industry. It's not completely pervasive, it's hard to find, but a lot of the studios and a lot of, CBS, for instance, has captured 4K from the Super Bowl last year. A lot of the production is being done in 4K, just none of the delivery is happening there. And so they're learning about some of these challenges. I think they're different from the challenges of 3D in that there will actually be demand. I think there's going to be an age of kind of pervasive and very watching of content very close to you is becoming a more the typical way that people are watching content, whether it's individualized or eventually on a large 4K TV where it's completely immersive. You're feeling like you're almost in that type of event or in that game. I think there's going to be an appeal to that. I think it's a real different experience. It's a trajectory as opposed to 3D. We know how that's gone, and I think that's because it was actually unappealing to a good percentage of the market. For me personally, something about my eyes, I wear glasses, I have astigmatism, it just isn't appealing to me, and it never has been. Even in a movie theater, it's something where I just don't connect with that form of entertainment. Let's say.
Well, I totally agree, and what we're seeing in 4K, especially the 10-bit versions and the 60 frame per second or even 120 that we've seen at some shows. There's something, like you say, immersive about that, but it's not that completely transition into some bizarre
different
viewer
it's
experience. It's just more
yep.
and better rendered, and of course we have this other issue, and I guess that has to do with just the large screen sets, and 4K sets aren't necessarily being sold on the basis of, oh wow, you get 4K.
Right.
They're just bigger screens.
Yep.
And as the market moves up to bigger screens, the whole MPEG 4 and MPEG 2 certainly runs out of steam. It starts looking pretty bad.
It does break down, but I also think some of the early 4K delivery that we'll see to the end consumer will be in that 2 to 3 foot experience, because that's becoming more normal for people to be watching on tablets, in an area where as you get closer, the screen can be smaller and you could still see the difference between HD and 4K. It's really common, obviously, for people to have just even a 32-inch type of monitor. That can be a really good experience for 4K when you're at a certain distance from it. I
guess you'll be in a pretty good position to be telling us who's doing what as we go down this road, right?
Hopefully.
Okay, well, we look forward to it.
Yeah,
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.